This is Words Aptly Spoken, which comes from Proverbs 25:11. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The written word is a precious treasure. We want to preserve written knowledge for God's glory and as an anchor to the history of the church and its classical conversations. We hope to encourage the reading of words and of the word. So, welcome to Words Aptly Spoken, where Jennifer, Courtney, Tim Knotts, and I discuss books from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum with you. This is a series for lovers of the Word made flesh. It's Wednesday, November 29th, 2023. I'm Lee Bortons, and today we're also joined by CCMM curriculum developer Kathy Donesia. Jennifer, tell us about this month's shows.
Okay, so we've been having a ton of fun discussing the ancient classics, assisted by Peter Leithart's study guide, Heroes of the City of Man. So we've gotten to talk about Hesiod's Theogony, Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, Virgil's epic poem, the Aeneid, and then we also recorded a special and very fun Thanksgiving episode on the Mayflower Compact. And today we're going to finish up with Homer's Odyssey.
That's really great, especially on the back of the Mayflower Compact, a journey that was really important to our country. You can access all of these past episodes at Lee on my YouTube channel. It's at Lee Bortons, or you can go to my website, leebortons.com, and there's links and archives. And I'm really excited about our finishing up this idea of journeying today and starting with our new theme next month. So, Jennifer, ask away.
All right. Well, you know what I'm going to ask you, Lee? Why is Homer's epic poem, the Odyssey, part of the Classical Conversations curriculum?
So, for a number of reasons. One, it's in Challenge 4. And at that age, a lot of students are able to be more reflective and look back onto other cultures besides their own. They've got a lot more reading under their belt and experience. And so that's why it's in the Challenge 4 seminar. It's also a practical reason it's in Challenge 4. Peter Leithart's book, that's our discussion guide, the brightest, not the brightest heaven invention, Heroes of the City of Man, includes the Odyssey in his collection. And, we're always being really aware of the costs and expenses for homeschooling families. And so by having one study guide that goes over 5 or 6 good books, like we do with The Brightest Heaven of Invention and the Heroes of the City of Man, it saves parents money. And then, of course, by reading original source documents, these books are easy to find in editions that are not really expensive. So when we were putting together the curriculum, when we had this great little resource to guide us through the books, it just made sense to stick with all of the stories in it. And like we said in the opening, the whole idea of journey, the CC journey, the homeschool journey, our journey as Americans and patriots, it's really easy for us to understand why in the Iliad and the Odyssey, getting home and enjoying your family are really important. And I also find it interesting we're talking about this after Thanksgiving, when so many of us traveled home through hopefully pleasant journey with no sirens distracting us.
No, but I will tell you, years ago, I did a talk at Great Homeschool Conventions about that very thing. What are the sirens that draw us away from our mission as homeschooling parents? So it's a metaphor that we can use for lots of journeys. And that's one reason it still speaks to us today. So I know one thing, I'm in Challenge 4 this year, and my own students are excited because that we just started the Odyssey. We've read the first 4 books, and they're very excited because they fell in love with the characters in the story of the Iliad, and they didn't want to let them go. So they're very happy that there's a sequel. So on that note, Kathy, we are picking up where the Iliad ended, or a little bit after it, by kind of looking at all those stories. What happened to all those guys after the end of the 10 years long Trojan War? So you want to introduce us, Kathy, to some of the characters and the setting and background so we can get started?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And it was interesting, you talked about the Odyssey as being similar to a sequel. My students were the same way. They loved hearing about, what happened to Agamemnon when he got home and what happened to the others. So that's really good. Of course, the name of the book is the Odyssey. So Odysseus is the main character of the Odyssey. He is the cunning Greek who fought alongside Achilles and Agamemnon and all the other heroes in the Iliad in the Trojan War. He's spent basically the last 10 years trying to get home to his wife, Penelope, and their son, Telemachus. And of course, we were trying to figure out 10 years in the war, 10 years, or approximately 10 years trying to get home, how young Telemachus must have been when he left and when he got home. The book, like others, begins right in the middle, in media res, in the middle of the story. So Odysseus is, at this point of the story at the beginning, he is stranded on an island with a goddess, Calypso. And Penelope is at home trying to hold off all these suitors who want to marry her. And they've invaded her house. It's a big hall, and the big feast hall, and they're pretty much camping out there. And she is up in her chambers weaving and trying to, basically making a great excuse for not committing to marrying any of them. And then Telemachus, the son, is searching for news of his father. So he ends up leaving and going and visiting some of the other heroes to try to find out something about where his father has been or where he is. They don't know if he's dead or alive. They think he's alive. There's lots of other characters in the epic, just like in the Iliad. There's a whole appendix in our version of the book with 100 characters. Some of the other important ones, though, are, of course, Athena, the goddess. She's the goddess that helps Odysseus throughout. And then Poseidon is opposed to Odysseus. And the reason he's opposed is we've all heard the story of the Cyclops. And the name of the Cyclops is Polyphemus. I think I'm pronouncing that right. And he is actually Poseidon's son. And so when Odysseus kills him, Poseidon's not very happy.
Yeah, I can remember being fascinated by that particular episode when I was a child.
Yeah.
That's kind of the one that grabs onto you, is that fight. I loved what you said about Telemachus going around and trying to get news of his father, because this is, again, one of those universal stories from war. And I wasn't expecting this, but I have the same students in CC that I had last year, and I read them some stories that my grandfather had written down about World War III when we were studying it. And when we read and discussed the first 4 books of the Odyssey, they said, this is just like when the US military sent your grandmother that telegram that they had lost her husband. Penelope's husband is missing. And since there are no telegrams and no Google, Telemachus has to get on a ship and sail around. And I just found it interesting that they made that great connection. So Kathy did a great job of setting us up with the setting and some of the characters. So Tim, you want to tell us kind of what's the outline of this plot that we start off with in the middle and then backtrack and then move forward and backtrack?
Yeah, that's a good point. And it is a little confusing for students who are reading it for the first time to figure out, wait, what's going on here and where are we in the story? A lot of the children's versions of this sort of leave off that complicated part of the story and just launch right in as if it were all one seamless flow instead of bouncing around. But really the bulk of the story that people know, the story of Polyphemus, the Cyclops, or Circe, who turns Odysseus's men to pigs, or the island of Helios, where the men kill and eat of the gods' cattle and are destroyed. All of those stories are actually told as a story by Odysseus as he's with the Phaeacians, these people who are seagoing people, and it's after all those adventures he's been washed up on shore, and they take him in and they give him a feast and they ask him to tell his story. He tells this whole long story of his wanderings and adventures, and then they sort of whisk him off home, and he, after all these arduous adventures of trying to get home, he's just sort of delivered. All of a sudden he arrives back at Ithaca, and into that situation that Kathy was just describing, where Penelope is sort of being assaulted by these ingrate suitors who are not behaving the way they should. And so the story is a lot about homegoing. It's also a lot about home and hospitality. In Greek mythology, Zeus is the god of strangers and hospitality, and he actually had sort of the behind the scenes power going on in the story, as he guides Odysseus, who wanders around, and it's his sort of ultimate plan that brings Odysseus home to set things aright in Ithaca when he gets there. At the beginning, when Telemachus is looking for news of his father, even then, he's not really wise enough to know what he doesn't know. Athena has to come alongside him and prompt him to go adventuring, looking for news, and through that to grow up into the right kind of son for Odysseus to come home to. Odysseus, when he arrives, he comes in disguise and tests Penelope to see whether she was faithful while he was gone, and he sort of uses some schemes to see if Telemachus is a good, upright young man or not. And even his father, at the end, when he arrives at his father's home after things have been set right in the king's hall, Athena kind of has to slap Odysseus' hand and say, stop it with all the deceiving. Just tell your dad who you are. And he does, and there is a sort of a joyous reunion finally at the very end of the book.
Yeah. And it's so much about home that this is an epic poem that even includes his return to his dog, which, students always appreciate that scene too. This is a very old dog, as Kathy pointed out. He's been gone 20 years. It's a really old dog, but he even makes an appearance. So, yeah. So I loved what you were talking about too, Tim, with Telemachus and Athena, because she comes in the guise of mentor, which has a lot to say for us about a young son needing a mentor, particularly with the absence of his father. And so that's a fun theme to think about as we're reading the Odyssey. So Kathy, we were talking about all these different epic heroes this month. We talked about them either having superhuman strength or superhuman cunning. They're like today's Marvel heroes. So what kind of a hero is our Odysseus?
Yeah, so of all the ancient heroes that I think of, they are known for their strength. They're big guys. They can fight really well. We just came off of reading the Iliad, so the greatest warriors were there. But I really like that Odysseus is known for being clever. And he's described as wily and cunning and crafty. And in the Iliad, he was one of the advisors to the leaders. He was often seen as a voice of reason with them. And I think wasn't even the Trojan horse Odysseus's idea. So I really like that about him, that he was cunning. He seemed to have reason and some wisdom.
Yeah, and it's interesting because some translations call him like the man of many devices or the man of many schemes. And I always have to remind myself that schemes are not always negative. We hear that as Americans and we think we're being conned, but then other countries, other English-speaking countries use the word scheme just to mean a plan. What's the plan? And he does always seem to be the man with the wise plan. So, all right. Well, Lee, you kick us off since we're now at the end and tell us who is your favorite character from this story, the Odyssey?
Well, in some ways, I want to say Kirk Douglas, because no matter what I do when I'm reading any of the Iliad Odyssey, I always see his movie version. So that might be a good segue to let parents know that if they're interested. Tim mentioned there's children's versions of the book, as well as there are some movies reflective of it. And even, George Clooney's, one of his latest ones, Brother, Where Art Thou, was fashioned after it. So if you have a hard time jumping into the classics, that's another way to introduce your children to this really great book. So I would say, I don't know if she's my favorite character as much as she's an interesting character to me, is Penelope. After 10, well, it's more than 10 years, but 10 years we know he's on his way back, and it's already been 10 years for her, and that's when the suitors are all starting to show up. For her to have that faithfulness and waiting for her husband, it makes me think of just how, like you've looked at that movie that Tom Hanks was in, whereas he came home and his wife was already married to somebody else. right? So she had faith and hope that he was going to return, and she stuck to her belief in her love for him. On the other hand, how'd you let all those men get in our house? And why was she not doing something more about, having them leave? And I know it's a story and that's all part of the plot to have those suitors there. So she's so strong in some ways, and in other ways, she's like, and I guess that's why we like the character so much. She's not always strong. She also is a woman who wonders, who's going to be the man that makes sure that my son really is a good king versus, do I wait for his dad? And, just the uncertainty, and she lives through it well.
Yeah. Yeah, so we said Odysseus is called the man of many devices. So she's usually called prudent Penelope or wise Penelope. So they're a good pair in that way. All right. Who's next? Who wants to name your favorite character?
I was thinking about Penelope also, Lee, for a different reason, and that's that I was thinking about what a match she must have been for Odysseus, because she demonstrated some of the same cunning that he had in the way she dealt with the suitors. They were camping out in her great hall and vying to marry her, and she was holding them off through her weaving. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I wouldn't think to go weaving to get the men out of the house. I also kind of wondered, why were they there? Like, was it public housing? Why were the men allowed to be in there? Why would they take advantage that way? Anyway.
I was wondering about that too, and I wonder if it had something to do with their look at hospitality being such a virtue that you don't say no to somebody. Like when a traveler would come, you wouldn't even ask who they were before you fed them and housed them. And
yeah, it reminds me of one of the first books we went over, Beowulf, and how there's the Great Hall, and everybody just kind of lives there. So it's a different kind of culture. And I suppose they got used to it the way we get used to ours. I think it sounds like an exciting kind of household to live in, but it also sounds a little bit wearying.
Yeah. So, I mean, Odysseus was the king, right? So this was his maybe private house, but it was also a great house, right? And one that people would have been coming to regularly for feasting and for hospitality. But the book is so much about that theme of hospitality, right? Polyphemus is there not just as sort of an interesting adventure, but as such a terrible example of hospitality, right? These wanderers come to his cave and he eats them. Instead of feeding them, he feeds on them. The Phaeacians are there as a great glowing example of hospitality when they take in this stranger who's been shipwrecked and they clothe him and they feed him and they do good to him. They not only do they take him home, but they give him presents and leave them with him when they take him there. So you have these really strong examples of good hospitality and bad hospitality. And Penelope is being a good hostess. It's the suitors who are being bad guests. And so they're there as an example of not the hospitality, the giving of hospitality, but the poor receiving of hospitality. And that, again, is something I think we can all learn from too, as we have opportunities to both extend and receive hospitality from people.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, when they send Odysseus home, one of the things that the king says is, I'll give a ship to the man who has a longing for his home. Well, that's a pretty big thing to say. Hospitality wise, it's one thing to host him in your house, but he wants to also get him home. So he is that shining example of how you care for someone. So there's some really poignant moments in this one that I love. Okay, so swiftly, everyone has to say your favorite epic now that you've named your favorite character. So just the one, not your favorite epic across all time and space, but the ones we've talked about this month. So which one did you like best?
I guess I like Oedipus Rex because it seems so modern in psychology that there's a lot of things to connect to. And it's a shorter, briefer book. It's a great introduction. And so that makes an easier introduction into these epic poems and stories.
I'm going to cheat and say the Iliad, the one that we didn't talk about. but the Odyssey is definitely a wonderful and close second place for me.
I really liked the Aeneid a lot, and I'm wondering if it was because I read it much closer than I read the other two.
Hmm.
I did a lot of highlighting, and so I started to understand more about Aeneas's character through that.
Do any of you have a good trick or mnemonic to help you remember that Aeneid is the one in Latin and Roman and the other two are Greek?
I just remember by their authors.
Yeah.
Virgil
Mm-hmm. Okay.
is quintessentially Latin, and Homer wrote the other two.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't think I have a memory trick either. Well, I have to say the Odyssey is my favorite and has long been my favorite. And I think it is because of the theme of home that is, and particularly for me as a woman, this one is easier to relate to than the Iliad. I can relate to Penelope being at home and waiting and trying to take care of the home and raise her son. And I have been in her shoes where it can be quite sobering as you usher your son toward manhood and realize that he needs other mentors besides you if he's going to grow into the man that he's supposed to be. And so this book has a special place in my heart. And also because I've read lots and lots of children's stories. We have Tanglewood Tales. We have some of the stories in Ancient World Echoes. So they make nice little individual stories all on their own as well. So
you didn't tell us your favorite character.
Oh, well, it's Penelope. I just thinking about being in her shoes. I have great empathy for her and the situation that she's placed in, and her steadfastness. And also, you just gotta love that she is honestly being faithful and weaving a death shroud for her father-in-law, which is an honorable thing to do. And yet she's also using it to trick the suitors by unweaving it and then reweaving it. So she's also just very clever. I just appreciate her faithfulness. So, all right. So I think it's time for our commercial break. Is that true?
Yes. So we want to thank our sponsor, classicalconversationsbooks.com, where the books discussed can be purchased. We have the entire 2023 Words Aptly Spoken calendar at leebortons.com with links to the CC book site. And start looking in the next week. You'll be seeing the calendar for 2024. So we're really excited to continue the conversation into the next year. In this December, which is the next month, we will start a new 4-week series of leadership books. We will discuss Listening for Heaven's Sake by Gary Sweeten, The Peacemaker by Ken Sande, and Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. We will also record a special Christmas episode to discuss one of our favorites, Barbara Robinson's The Best Christmas Pageant Ever. So I really look forward to December and what it's going to do for our spirit, as well as to 2025's book list and what it's going to do to just grow us together and just our love for literature. So thanks for helping lead these, you guys.
Yeah, it's very fun. And we do have a great calendar coming up for 2024 as well. So I'm excited to keep going. All right. Well, now is the time where we look closely at the book itself. And in this case, we'll look both at part of the Odyssey and part of I almost said Postman, part of Leithart's study guide about the epic poem. So Kathy, will you read us the opening lines of the Odyssey so that we can start at the beginning?
Yes. Sing to me of the man, Muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course. Once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. Many cities of man he saw and learned their minds. Many pains he suffered, heartsick on the open sea, fighting to save his life and bring his comrades home. But he could not save them from disaster, hard as he strove. The recklessness of their own ways destroyed them all, the blind fools. They devoured the cattle of the sun, and the sun god wiped from the sight of day of their return. Launch out on his story, Muse, daughter of Zeus. Start from where you will. Sing for our time, too.
Well, first I have to say something comical, and then we'll get serious. There is a meme that floats around Facebook just about every quarter, it seems like, which looks like, an ancient Greek piece of art. And it's Odysseus talking to his men on the ship, and they say, "What's an Odyssey?" And he said, "A journey from which only the main character returns alive." And they go, "Oh, wait, what?" So I always think about that meme whenever I see these opening lines.
He's the only one. Well, one
Yeah.
thing I noticed right away is Leithart's title comes from the passage you picked, Cities of Man, and how Odysseus and Agamemnon and Oedipus and all these folks that we've been talking about this last month were heroes of the city of man, in contrast with the hero of the city of heaven and our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ.
Yeah. And it's interesting to think about Odysseus here seeing all of these. It's such an interesting line. Many cities of man he saw and learned their minds. This is one of the reasons why he's the man of many devices too, is because he has a vast amount of experience of humankind. So
Yeah. Earlier you mentioned the sirens, one of the adventures he has along the way, right? The sirens who beguile the minds of their hearers and draw them to jump into the ocean and die, pursuing whatever vision it is that they have. The sirens have given them this sort of irresistible desire. And in Greek myth, we already talked about this with Hesiod a little bit, but the muses were inspirers not just of beautiful things, but of true things. And so they're almost a counterpart to the sirens. The sirens deceive men, and the muses were the ones who delivered truth to men. And so as Homer starts off here, he's calling on the muse not just to be eloquent, but to actually be informed, to have the information to share, as well as how he would say it. And I love that last little bit, sing for our time too. Right, that the muses aren't just giving him this story because it's history or it's entertaining, but it's actually useful for us as we hear it for our time.
What a great phrase, to sing for our time too. I think that if we could teach more history and literature with that in mind, not necessarily little children, because we read great books to them and they love literature, but there's kind of this transition from young children's literature to something as difficult as this. And we don't have a lot of good books, or there are a lot of good books in between, but I don't think people know about them or take the time to read them. And that's what I love about the Challenge A, B, and 1 literature. There's a lot of books to read. And almost all the books, I mean, I can't think of one that doesn't sing for our time too. I just feel like we need a whole podcast now around that phrase.
I know. And we talked about this in the previous podcast this month, just that Greek idea of the public nature of poetry. And so we see it here again, that the poet has this public job to do, to sing these stories, not just to record them for posterity, but to teach the lessons that they have to teach us. And so I love, there is a scene where there is a blind poet in the Odyssey who comes to the feast, and they teach him how to reach for his lyre because he can't see it. And I just love it that Homer wrote himself into the story, or someone along the way did. Just that, to keep that thread going, that these storytellers are so important for our souls. So.
Yeah, and that on that theme, right? It's funny that he calls them the blind fools, where he himself was blind, right? But he was only physically blind. And and that's a great conversation to have with your kids about the difference between physical blindness and spiritual blindness, right? That Christ talks about that too, that he calls the Pharisees blind guides, even though they're not physically blind. And he had just healed a blind man to give him sight.
Yeah, that's a great theme that runs through it. All right.
Well, it also makes me think about how the Cyclops, even though he did have the one eye, it wasn't enough for perspective. You need two. I don't know.
And even that one he lost.
And then, yeah, that's what I was thinking too. And then he loses that one, which is a lesson for you to be kind to strangers who are in your home. Oh, all right. Well, So we talked about this theme of blindness, and we've talked about sort of the timelessness of the theme of seeking for home. And we've sort of danced around the next theme, which is just this idea of the restoration of order, which has to happen after every war and disruption. And of course, the longer the king is away, the worse condition the kingdom gets in. And so all of these men who returned from the war, were all kings of their own places, whether that was Sparta or Pylos or wherever they were kings of, they all had to come home and restore order if they made it home or someone else did. So Leithart really talks about that theme. So Lee, do you want to read us our next passage? It's on page 151 in Heroes.
Sure. As in the Iliad, Homer continues to be concerned with order and disorder. The Iliad shows that men at war become something less than human. They slip down the chain of being to the level of animals. And when men act like animals, there's no possibility of order among them. The Odyssey moves away from the chaos of war toward the restoration of order, especially the order of the household. Homer is showing the kind of character required to establish and maintain order. Not fleet Achilles or even patriotic Hector can bring peace. It takes the wiles and the cunning of an Odysseus.
I was just thinking of what a contrast it is between war and the home. Just such opposites.
I don't know that I agree with they slip down the chain of being to the level of animals. I think that's what bravery and heroism is that when you're in that opportunity, and you don't have to be at war for that to happen, and you remember that you are not just a little better than the beasts, but instead you're just a little lower than the angels, and you know whose image you're made in. And I think those are the stories we really like, and that's why these ancient literature stories, the characters we like, resonate so well with us because they did rise above the situation they're in.
I always found it confusing to some degree that in the Greek mythology, there were two gods of war. There's Ares, right, who's the god of warfare, and you have Athena, who's also the goddess of war, but Ares is the god of that sort of brute strength and chaos of fighting, and Athena is the goddess of strategy and careful planning in war. And so it's no wonder that she loves Odysseus, right? He's squarely in her camp as that sort of a fighter. But you see that in the Iliad. You see the conflict between the Ares kind of war and the Athena kind of war. And so I think that might be some of what Leithart is pointing out here, is that it's not all war, but those who give themselves over to it, that they don't fight like on Achilles' shield in that Hephaestus, the god of the forge, makes for him at behest of Achilles' mother, are images of all the domestic life in Greece, that dancing and feasting in the home, to be reminded that what he's fighting for is those things. He's not fighting for the sake of fighting. He's fighting for the sake of home. And he needs that reminder. Whereas Odysseus is always driven by trying to get back. It's a different kind of fighter.
Do you think that's ever different in any war? I'm thinking about what's going on now with Hamas and Israel. Not picking sides, just the fact that it's a war. Don't they all just want to protect their home? Not necessarily the aggressors, but the people who just live there, the average human being.
I think it varies, right?
Yeah.
The depravity of the heart of man, in times of chaos and in times of that sort of fighting, there are those who will, I think, descend to the place of reveling in destruction and in their own strength, and not in trying to seek to preserve anything, but just to hurt and to harm and destroy.
Yeah, and that can even be true in metaphorical struggles too, or culture struggles, that there are some who seek to destroy and not rebuild. So yeah. I think both of those things are present. I mean, I know what you mean about Leithart. It's a gross overgeneralization, perhaps, to say that they drop to the level of animals, but there are moments when I think they all must, particularly in the brutal hand-to-hand combat that's in the Iliad. It's pretty hard not to. And I was thinking of a story my grandfather told me when he was on the Philippines in World War II, and he was off from his men and having some lunch, and he encountered so it was him by himself, and he encountered a single Japanese soldier by himself, also away from his men and also eating lunch. And they looked at each other, and they were both armed, and they both walked away because there was something about that moment that was a sacred individual humanity versus the battle. And so I think both of those things are always happening.
No, I'm not saying they're not. Just I watch a lot of war movies, and I think a lot about history, and sometimes I want to watch movies from the other so-called enemy side to figure out, what were you protecting? What were you thinking? There's bad people on both sides. And generally they feel like their home is being damaged.
Yeah. I think that's the perfect conversation to have around the Iliad. Is so much about that. Hector's not a bad guy. Achilles and Menelaus and Odysseus are not bad guys. Aeneas is not a bad guy, but they're fighting on opposite sides of a very brutal war.
Yeah, and we keep not discussing the Iliad, but discussing it. So Hector's my favorite character because he is honorable, and he is altogether about defending his home and his wife and his small son. And Homer writes a very, very, very honorable adversary, which is perhaps an unusual thing to do. Hector comes off looking like a very excellent man. So
I was thinking about the reasons men would go to war and how what place propaganda plays in motivating men, even for a just war. But you think about World War II in Germany, and they had to have some way of motivating the people to take up arms and fight and make it appear that there's something that they're defending.
So maybe it's also about appearances. I bet's another theme in all these books we didn't talk about.
Yeah. And for some of the guys in some of these heroes, it was the idea of glory. They really believed that by gaining that glory, they would have an immortal life afterward.
Which I think we still see playing out today.
Yeah.
All right, next one.
Right. So Tim, I think we're on the closing lines, because believe it or not, we're almost out of time for this book club. I can't believe that's true, but so Kathy read the opening and Lee read something from the middle. And so Tim, we'll let you read us the closing lines for us to discuss.
Great. Yeah. So this is at the home of Odysseus's father, who he's finally reunited with, but it's after the slaughter of the suitors, and the people of the people related to those suitors are now very angry at Odysseus and have come sort of looking for a fight. So Athena steps in here at the end, and she says, "Hold back, you men of Ithaca, back from brutal war. Break off, shed no more blood, make peace at once." So Athena commanded. Terror blanched their faces. They went limp with fear, weapons slipped from their hands. "Royal son of Laertes, Odysseus, master of exploits, hold back now. Call a halt to the great leveler, war. Don't court the rage of Zeus who rules the world." So she commanded. He obeyed her, glad at heart. And Athena handed down her pacts of peace between the sides for all the years to come. I love it. And they all lived happily ever after ending.
It's right here. Let me tie a bow on it.
Yeah.
I just keep thinking about Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, because you're just like here, you're so tired of fighting by the time you get to this point in the story. And in Tolkien, you feel like once the ring goes into to Mount Mordor, it should be over, right? But he doesn't end it there. He ends with them returning to the Shire. and restoring order to home, which is where they had set out from, and they have to protect that last place. And in some ways, it just reminds me so much of Odysseus. He's probably also supremely tired of fighting and probably thinks the end of the Trojan War should have been the end of the fighting, but he has to go home and scour his home too.
Yeah, and it's extra sad, right? When these heroes who have fought against what is real evil come home and find echoes of it at home, right? It's not the same kind of evil, but it's these smaller versions of something evil going on, and they have to fight at their very home against people who they shouldn't have to fight against, people who should be their friends and their neighbors, but instead have adopted this evil point of view. And it's sad in both stories, in both the Lord of the Rings and here, that they don't just have a happy homecoming in the first place. They have to come home and fight for it even at home.
But that also echoes the bigger story. Jesus Christ has put sin and death down, and yet we're still scouring our own shire, whether it's the sin in our own heart or the people around us who don't believe that the Lord's done that for us, and haven't asked the Holy Spirit to guide them. So it's a really big story.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, so the muses answered, and they sang a story for our day too.
Never ends. So I guess like Odysseus and Penelope could continue because they knew there was a home. And that's our hope too as Christians. And that's the sad part about people who don't know. There's so much more. The best is yet to come.
Yep. And on that theme, Jesus Christ is the Prince of Peace, right? It's Athena here who brings this pact of peace, but we have a better peace in him.
Yeah.
Good.
A permanent
one. Sounds like a good place to stop. Thank you guys for enjoying the Prince of Peace and all that he has for us, and the various stories throughout the ages that reflected what he has that's our best for us and for our community. So look forward to next week's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.